She stood silent beside a luxury car, wrists cuffed, dignity intact, while the man in uniform roared at ghosts only he could see. The sun glinted off the polished Bentley behind her, a mirror to the calm in her eyes and the fury in his. His voice thundered through the street, barking accusations laced with assumption, while she said nothing, not because she was powerless, but because her silence cut deeper than any protest. People began to slow, some pulling out their phones, others just watching, unsure if they were witnessing law or something far uglier. She didn't flinch, didn't plead. Her poise, her stillness, her refusal to bend, it rattled him. He thought she was no one, just another face to command, another voice to silence. But in 10 minutes he'd be on his knees, begging for forgiveness. Comment where you're watching from, because this story will change how you see silence and strength. Ariana West moved through the world like rain, soft but certain, her presence never loud, yet impossible to ignore. At 32, she was one of the youngest federal judges in the country, known for her sharp mind and steady poise. But beneath the tailored calm was a woman molded by years of silent wounds, side eyes in elevators, assumptions in luxury stores, questions about credentials even after victories. Every success she earned carried the echo of a bruise no one else saw. That morning, she drove through a sun-drenched suburban street in a black Bentley, dressed in clean, understated elegance, pressed slacks, modest heels, a small gold pin on her lapel. In the passenger seat rested her briefcase, carefully holding the speech she was scheduled to deliver that afternoon. Its title, embossed in silver, Justice Begins with How We Look at Each Other. Officer Rick Dalton had been patrolling that neighborhood for years. A stocky, red-faced man in his late 40s, he moved with the self-assurance of someone who'd never had his authority questioned. His instincts were blunt, shaped by years of assumptions and an ego that had never been asked to examine itself. When he saw the Bentley glide past him with a black woman at the wheel, his eyebrows twitched before his hands even touched the siren. "Just a routine stop, ma'am," he muttered as he approached her window, though in his mind the verdict had already been written. He didn't see a judge, or a speaker, or a woman who had memorized the Constitution backwards. He saw skin, a car, and a conclusion. The street was lined with trimmed hedges and freshly paved driveways. Wealth was welcome here, just not when it wore brown skin. The moment Ariana eased the Bentley to a stop, she felt it. The familiar weight, pressing on her chest, not from guilt, but from memory. Officer Rick Dalton approached the car with exaggerated authority, already gesturing before her window rolled down. "License and registration," he barked, his tone laced with suspicion, rather than procedure. Ariana reached for her documents calmly, offering them without a word. Her composure unsettled him. Her silence was not fear. It was knowing, but he read it as arrogance. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped, cutting off any chance for her to speak. She obeyed, her movements slow, deliberate. People began to pause, drivers, joggers, passers-by, glancing toward the scene as if sensing something wasn't right. Rick's voice rose, louder now, echoing down the street. "Whose car is this, huh?" he demanded, gesturing toward the Bentley. Ariana looked him in the eye. "Mine," she said softly. No edge, no emotion, just truth. But the calmness in her voice made him flinch. It was the kind of composure that exposed his chaos. With a huff, he pulled out his handcuffs and without hesitation locked her wrists together. They clicked shut with finality, glinting like shackles repurposed for new injustices. Against her skin, they looked too familiar, like history repeating, itself in broad daylight. She felt every gaze on her, every phone slowly raised to record, every breath tightening. She wanted to speak, to tell him who she was, what she was late for, the irony of the speech in her briefcase. But something deeper held her back. Decades of knowing that sometimes silence was safer than truth. She looked forward, saying nothing. And that silence? It lit a fire in Rick. "Got nothing to say now?" he growled. But Ariana didn't answer. She didn't need to. Then it came. The radio at his shoulder crackled to life. Dispatch's voice rang out, urgent and clear. "Unit 32. Be advised, Judge Ariana West, en route to the State Justice Summit, may be in your vicinity. Do not delay her vehicle." Rick froze. The color drained from his face. His hand trembled near his belt. Around him, the onlookers leaned in, sensing the shift. And Ariana. She simply turned her head, meeting his eyes, with the quiet authority of someone who had just let her silence speak volumes. The moment her title echoed from the dispatch, it was as if the entire block exhaled at once. Judge Ariana West. The name landed like a thunderclap. Officer Rick Dalton stood paralyzed, the cuffs still binding her wrists, the weight of what he'd done suddenly crashing in. The once curious crowd leaned in closer, their uncertain murmurs now turning into unmistakable recognition. Phones were no longer filming out of habit. They were capturing history, unraveling. The woman he'd humiliated wasn't just anyone. She was the keynote speaker of a police reform summit, a federal judge, a symbol of justice itself. Ariana slowly raised her eyes, locking her gaze on him for the first time. The calm in her stare was unflinching, not cold, not cruel, but deeply disappointed. Rick stumbled over his breath, trying to recover. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice cracking under the pressure of his own collapse. But Ariana didn't speak. Not yet. She let the moment stretch. Let the silence carve its lesson into the space between them. Let him feel the full burn of realization as the weight of those handcuffs dug into her skin and his conscience. Finally, with the same calm she had maintained all along, she spoke, low and steady. "I suggest you unlock these," she said, her words deliberate, almost gentle, "before the weight of them breaks your knees." He fumbled with the key, fingers trembling as he unclasped the cuffs. Her wrists bore faint red marks, but she didn't rub them. She didn't flinch. She simply took a step back and turned toward the courthouse behind them. The setting was poetic. The grand marble steps rising behind her, banners for the Justice Summit fluttering in the breeze. That building, standing tall and timeless, now served as a silent witness to the irony unfolding before it. The same badge that should have protected her had tried to strip her dignity, and now, beneath the same sun that had once illuminated her shame, it illuminated her rise. Ariana lifted the briefcase from her car and walked forward, heels clicking with purpose. The crowd parted like water, reverent, speechless. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Officer Rick Dalton stood alone now, shoulders hunched, the cuffs still in his hand, but their weight had shifted. They no longer represented control. They represented failure, his and a system's. And as Ariana disappeared through the courthouse, doors, her speech in hand, Her silence once again said everything. Of course. Here's a longer and more emotionally layered version of Part 5, matching your deep storytelling tone, poetic rhythm, and gradual transformation arc. Approx. 800 words. The video spread faster than any press release could contain. Within hours, millions had seen the footage. Judge Ariana West, hands bound behind her back, standing in silence while Officer Rick Dalton barked at her in the middle of a suburban street. The internet reacted with fury. Comment sections filled with disbelief and rage. News anchors called it a national embarrassment. But Ariana didn't fan the fire. She didn't take interviews. She declined morning show requests. And when asked if she'd sue the department, her response came through a carefully worded statement delivered on courthouse steps, with cameras flashing and voices shouting for headlines. "I have no intention of suing," she said, "because this isn't about vengeance. It's about vision, about seeing what we've chosen to ignore. You don't reform people with rage. You rewire them with reflection." And then she announced her plan, a new initiative, the Second Glance, a program she would personally design and lead, a space where law enforcement officers would sit in rooms filled not with numbers or statistics, but with people, stories, faces, where they would be asked, for perhaps the first time in their careers, to look beyond a badge or uniform, and examine the lens through which they saw the world. At the top of the list of required participants, Officer Rick Dalton. When Rick walked into the first session, he was nearly unrecognizable. The crisp uniform had been replaced with jeans and a wrinkled shirt. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. He took a seat in the back corner of the community center and said nothing. But he stayed. Session after session, he came back. He watched as a young black mother spoke about the fear of sending her son to school in a hoodie. He listened as a teenager talked about being followed around grocery stores. And he heard, over and over, how a moment, one glance, one raised voice, one assumption, could steal dignity without drawing a weapon. Ariana didn't treat Rick any differently than the others. She never brought up the handcuffs, never pointed him out. Her lessons were quiet but piercing, asking them to journal their gut reactions, question the source of their fear, and most importantly, sit in discomfort without deflection. By the third week, Rick stood up. It was unplanned, unforced. The room stilled as he walked toward the front, clearing his throat like a man preparing to cross a line he could never return from. "I've been in law enforcement for 20 years, he began, voice low but clear. "And for 20 years, I thought I was fair. I thought I was doing my job right. But the truth is, I was only seeing what I'd been taught to see." He paused, hands clasped tight in front of him. "She didn't humiliate me that day," he said, glancing toward Ariana. "She held a mirror, and I didn't like what I saw." The silence in the room was heavy, but not cold. Some heads nodded. Others just stared, processing the weight of his confession. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. "She didn't yell at me," he continued. "She didn't fight. And that made it worse, because her silence was louder than anything I'd ever heard. I looked at her, and I saw what I was trained to expect. Not who she was, not what she had earned, just skin. And that shame belongs to me." Ariana's gaze never broke. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. But in her stillness there was something almost sacred. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Later that week, Rick asked if he could volunteer at the next second glance session, not as a participant, but as a speaker, not to defend himself, but to help others like him confront the rot they'd buried under the name of procedure. Ariana approved the request without ceremony. There were no press releases, no viral headlines, just quiet progress. A man beginning to unlearn, a woman continuing to lead. The poetic contrast could not be denied. The man who had once bound her wrists in the name of law now used his voice to unravel the very blindness that put her in cuffs, and the woman who once stood in silence, shamed and restrained, now led a movement that made silence impossible. The courtroom was no longer her only arena. Ariana had created something far larger than herself. The second glance was no longer a program, it was a mirror held up to an entire system. And the first man to truly look into it was the same one who once looked at her and saw nothing at all. Rick never asked for redemption, and Ariana never offered it like a gift. It was something he had to earn in silence. He didn't seek interviews or try to clear his name through the media. He simply showed up, week after week, to the second glance, sitting in the back with a notebook in his lap and his ego left at the door. He volunteered for community outreach shifts, took calls others avoided, and began walking through neighborhoods he once feared, with no hand resting on his holster. He became a quiet ally, not defined by apologies, but by changed behavior, and that mattered more than anything spoken from a podium. Meanwhile, Ariana's speech, the one that almost never made it to the summit, echoed far beyond the courthouse. Departments across the country requested recordings. Training academies invited her to speak. Her words didn't just call for reform. They demanded recognition. Recognition of dignity, of nuance, of the deep harm done by looking at someone and only seeing a stereotype. Officers who once rolled their eyes at equity seminars now leaned in when she spoke, not because she was loud, but because she was impossible to ignore. Months later, the city held a ceremony. Quiet, no parade. Just a gathering of community members, city officials, and a few officers in uniform. On that exact strip of sidewalk, where Ariana had once stood in silence, cuffs burning against her skin, the city unveiled a bronze plaque set into the pavement. It read, "Judge Ariana West stood here so others could rise." It didn't mention the arrest. It didn't have to. The ground itself remembered, and now it would speak. As Ariana passed by with her briefcase tucked under one arm, a little black girl tugged her mother's hand and pointed. "She looks like me," the girl whispered. Her mother, smiling through glassy eyes, nodded and replied, "She fights for you." Ariana heard them. She didn't turn, but her steps grew steadier. She no longer flinched when police lights flickered in her rearview mirror, no longer braced herself every time she drove through wealthy neighborhoods. Something had changed, not just in policy, not just in training, slides, but in her soul. The silence she had once used as a shield was now her sword, and Rick, once a symbol of everything she had fought against, had become proof that growth was possible, even for those who had never known how blind they were. He didn't call her judge the last time they met. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." She nodded back. No speech, no ceremony, just two people who had changed each other in a way no courtroom ruling ever could. She rewrote justice not in courtrooms, but on pavement, in pauses, in stillness, in the uncomfortable, necessary act of making people look again. And finally, Ariana West could drive home, not as a target, but as a torchbearer, while Rick Dalton no longer saw skin, cars, or clothing. He saw people, and that changed everything. He cuffed her with cruelty. She uncuffed a culture with grace. In a world where power often screams and justice sometimes whispers too late, Judge Ariana West proved that the most powerful revolutions begin not with fists, but with stillness. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. She stood, she waited, and she let the truth expose itself. What does justice look like when it refuses to scream, but chooses to stand still? Sometimes it looks like a woman in cuffs refusing to bow her head. Sometimes it looks like a man learning to see for the first time. If this story opened your eyes, share it, because silence doesn't always mean surrender, and dignity never shouts. Thank you for walking with us through stories that heal. We'll see you next time, where power meets humility and truth walks free.